Now, from time to time I get emails from someone called gov.uk.email. We originally signed up for these travel alerts during COVID, and it was related to someone needing to get back to the United States. But if you go on the government website, you will find information about travel to almost every country in the world. Accordingly, you'll find that there doesn't actually seem to be anywhere safe in the world to go to. Even Iceland, which is claimed to be the safest country in the world, if you keep away from volcanoes and things, it says no country is guaranteed safe. But of course there are countries like Afghanistan which they recommend you certainly do not travel to. And of course if you look at Israel today, the advice is very mixed. There are certain parts where you certainly should not go to, and it's pretty ambivalent on anywhere else in the country. But let's put ourselves back nearly 2,000 years. I'd say the travel advice wasn't much different then, that Israel was not a recommended place to visit. So we sit ourselves in the scene. It's about AD 58. The Roman province of Judea is ruled by a series of oppressive governors, and there's significant religious and ethnic tension. And within a few years, there'll be widespread unrest which will break into open rebellion. In fact, the Jewish rebels will massacre the garrison in Jerusalem of Roman soldiers there, and they will form their own provisional government. And this time there's increasing anti-Roman, anti-Gentile sentiment, and there's targeted assassinations of those considered to be pro-Roman sympathizers by a group called the Sicarii, who are kind of a society of assassins. In this year, the high priest himself, Jonathan, will be assassinated because of his alleged pro-Roman sympathies. And he will be killed actually within the temple courts. So this is the environment the Apostle Paul is going back to. He is not just aware that it's going to be dangerous, he really knows that something bad is going to happen. And actually every believer he's been meeting on his way back to Jerusalem has begged him not to go. But he believes it's God's will to go there, and nothing is going to stand in the way of that. Now, before we continue, we'll just recap the story that we've got so far. Over the last few weeks in our study of Acts, we have followed the final stages of Paul's return to his third missionary journey back to Jerusalem. And along the way, Christians have been warning him that great danger awaits him. And these were not just speculations, they were not premonitions. These were actually direct warnings from God. And when he gets to Caesarea, which is the first port in Israel, the prophet Agabus, who's quite a famous prophet of those times, tells Paul that he will be bound and handed over to the Gentiles by the Jewish leaders. But Paul is not deterred by this. It is true that God has sent these warnings, but they are not really for Paul. They are for other Christians, his friends, the church, to give them confidence that actually God is in control. Paul knows very well what's going to happen, but these are just to assure the other Christians that God is actually in control and knows, so they won't be surprised when they see it all apparently go wrong. Now, Paul, for his part, he believes he's in God's path, and no matter how difficult it is, he will be nowhere else. He's not being foolhardy, he's not being reckless. That was not Paul. But neither did he allow the fear of future danger, the fear of man, to deter him from being where God wanted him. Now, 2 weeks ago, I must say I'm indebted to some notes Mike's given me and some very fancy pictures which we're about to see. 2 weeks ago, Mike preached on Paul's actual return to Jerusalem when he arrived. And when we left Paul, things actually surprisingly were going very well. If you remember, the elders of the church at Jerusalem had asked Paul for a favour. Rumours were rife that Paul had been teaching Jews to abandon their cultural heritage, to abandon the temple, abandon everything that was Jewish about them. And they asked Paul, therefore, to demonstrate his goodwill, to demonstrate that these allegations are actually false, that there was no truth in them at all, that he would do them a favour, that he would sponsor 4 men who were fulfilling a Nazirite vow. And what it involved Paul would accompany them, these 4 men, to the temple, over a 7-day period. He would pay for their sacrifices, he would pay their expenses, and at the end, they would go through a purification ceremony, and Paul himself would have to go through a purification ceremony because he had just arrived back from Gentile lands. But they were sure that anyone seeing this display of allegiance to the Jewish faith would realize that there's nothing true about these allegations. Paul would have clarified his position, Jewish Christians would be assured, reassured, and everyone would be happy. And Paul willingly agreed to do this. At first sight, it seemed strange to us that he did, because he didn't have to. And we tend to think of Paul as someone who championed Christian liberty over the law of Moses. And you'd thought, surely he's going against his own principles. But there's nothing inconsistent about Paul doing this. And Mike actually covered this in great detail 2 weeks ago. Because it demonstrated how Paul would sacrifice his own freedoms to protect the unity of the church and avoid stumbling others. And perhaps you might remember Mike's application from this. At the beginning of the sermon, he posed this question. Now, I'm quoting from Mike's sermon. How far would you go as a Christian in this church to do what Paul urges us to do in Romans 14? Make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. Or perhaps to put it in modern parlance, we might say, bend over backwards to accommodate others. So how far would you go? And further to that, he then gave a quite comprehensive range of examples of what it might look like in real life. So if you weren't there, which I think most of people were, or have forgotten about it, it might be an idea to give it a re-listen. Now, we've got quite a lot to go through this morning, so we won't go through verse by verse because we'd be absolutely ages here. So we'll just go over a brief skip over as a narrative. So as we mentioned earlier, Paul, at the request of the elders, was effectively doing what they said. Things seemed to be working. At the end of the 7th day of the purification process, there was to be a ceremony to mark the completion of the ritual, and it was nearly over. The 7 days had all been but accomplished. Paul had practically completed everything that had been required of him. And then something unexpected and disastrous occurred. Jews from Asia, in all likelihood Jews from Ephesus, perhaps the very same Jews who had plotted against Paul back in Acts 20, saw Paul in the temple. And it's quite revealing that actually, up to this point, none of the local Jews had really bothered with him. And he'd remained unscathed. But anyway, earlier, these Jews had seen Paul in the company of Trophimus, an Ephesian, a Gentile, and had incorrectly assumed that Paul had brought these in to the temple. Now, this would have been actually a very serious infringement. Could we see the picture of the temple? To give you an idea, there is some uncertainty about how accurate this is. This is the scale model actually in Jerusalem. But if you look, there's this area called the Court of the Gentiles, which Gentiles were allowed to go in. And then there's inside there's an inner court surrounded by a wall. And inside that, if you're a Gentile, you are not allowed in at all. There were notices between the entrances in Greek and Latin, just in case people didn't get the point, that anyone entering there would enter on pain of death. The text of one notice which they've discovered ran like this: no foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and enclosure. Anyone who is caught trespassing will bear personal responsibility for his ensuing death. Now, even a Roman citizen was not exempt from this. He was not protected. The Roman authorities were so conciliatory to the Jews that they authorized the death sentence no matter who the offenders were. And quickly, these Jews stirred up a mob. They appealed to their fellow Israelites, help us. It is our duty to deal with this man, this enemy of the faith of our fathers. They had two accusations. Paul, this man who is destroying our heritage and religious culture, has arrived back here and is here, and he has defiled the temple by bringing a Gentile into its courts. And soon, the whole city, not just the temple, was in utter uproar. They dragged Paul out of the inner court of the temple, and they closed the gates, so they're now in the court of the Gentiles. Now, this probably did save Paul's life, because if he had been in the inner court, the Roman soldiers would not have been able to intervene. But I'm pretty sure that their reason for dragging him out into the outer court was not for Paul's safety. It was simply they didn't want to have a dead body at some point within the inner court. And that was where it was going to end up. Right next to the temple, much to the irritation of the Jews, there had been built what's called the Antonia Fortress. And it actually was probably nearly a couple of hundred years old. It had been built in the time of the Maccabees, but Herod the Great had rebuilt it in honor and named it in honor of Mark Antony. And stationed there was the military commander of the city, the Chiliarch, the tribune, and he had at his disposal 1,000 soldiers, 760 foot soldiers, 240 cavalry. And it was connected to the outer court by 2 flights of steps, which aren't obvious on that, but I'm assured that was true, so that the garrison could actually intervene in any disturbance very quickly. And quickly he received the report that there was a massive disturbance going on in the city. And so he sent not just a few soldiers, he sent probably 200 soldiers down there to intervene and put things right. And they waded in. I mean, it says that when they saw them, the Jews left off beating Paul, which was very good of them, I suppose. But the impression we get from what the Jews said later is that the soldiers were actually quite heavy-handed, which Roman soldiers tended to be. And then they formally arrested Paul, who had been beaten up by the mob. Now, the tribune was actually responsible for law and order in the city. And so whatever had been happening, he had to get to the bottom of, he had to deal with legally. But he could get no sense out of what anyone was saying. It didn't seem, it was so confused. So he decided to remove Paul, bring him back to the barracks. So he has him handcuffed to 2 soldiers. And then the crowd close in. And they're jostling and they're mobbing, so that the soldiers have to carry Paul up the steps lest he get dragged away. When they get to the top of the steps, you can imagine what Paul would look like. He'd been utterly beaten up. He'd probably be bleeding. He'd be dirt all over him. His clothes would have been ripped. He'd been bruised and battered. But he was not shaken or cowed. The tribune, on the other hand, seeing Paul in this very sorry state, makes a completely incorrect assumption. In these troubled times, there were no shortage of impostors who would cause trouble. Sometimes they would lead people into the wilderness. Sometimes they would stir up revolts, or perhaps both. And we have 2 examples of those in Acts 2. In this case, he thinks he's this Egyptian who 3 years earlier had stirred up a revolt, led several thousand assassins into the wilderness, and then disappeared. And here he is back again causing trouble. And so that's his supposition. But he's completely taken aback when this man speaks to him in an educated Greek voice, asking permission to address the mob below. And so perhaps he assumes he might learn a bit more about what really is going on. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd have thought if I was Paul at that point, I'd have taken my ticket out of there. You'd have thought he'd had quite enough. He'd been treated very badly, violently, despicably. But he loves his nation, not simply because of kinship, but because they are God's people. And they have been given so much grace and favour and privilege by God that he feels that God is giving them one last chance. It had rejected the gospel. The other apostles had now left the city. James himself would be murdered soon. AD 66, the church would be completely gone because by that time there was a revolution. Within 13 years, the city would be gone. Everything would be destroyed. A quarter of the population of Judea would have been killed. Many others taken into captivity. This was their last chance. So what would Paul say? What would you say? Does he preach them a sermon? Does he rebuke them? Does he tell them that they are not in God's way and they need to repent? Does he remonstrate with them about their treatment of him? About the false charges against him? No, he doesn't. Any of these. he tells them his story. He tells them it gently, winsomely, and sensitively, how he became a Christian. So there are three parts. It's a very simple story. What I was, what changed me, what I am now. The crowd is very rowdy and noisy, but when he raises his hand, they calm down a bit, and suddenly they hear him speak in Aramaic, which takes them completely aback, because this Gentile Paul, surely, why would he speak in their native language? And they fall respectfully silent. You could hear a pin drop. So what I was, Paul stresses his Jewishness, his ties, ancestral and practical, with Moses and the law. He says to them, look, I understand your position. I was zealous for God just like you are now. I understand where you're coming from. It is no secret that I was the persecutor of the way. In fact, in my zeal, I did more than any of my compatriots at the time. I arrested, I imprisoned, I travelled far and wide on my task to stamp out this religion you call heresy. And if they would admit it, the elders of this city, the high priests at the time, would admit this because they know it. But what changed? I did not stop doing this because I wanted to. I was stopped from this against my own will and my own inclinations. On my last mission of persecution, I was blinded by a great light, and the one I was fighting against spoke to me. And that changed everything. I did what I was told. Sightless, I was led to Damascus, where Ananias, a devout and law-abiding Jew, just like any of you, was used by God to restore my sight. And from him, I was told what to do. Paul is masterly in his tact, charm, emphasizing even to this rowdy crowd of really people who've been quite horrible to him, that he was not abandoning his heritage, that God had used the lips of a pious and believing Jew for his recovery. What he became. Now, Paul recounts how he came back to Jerusalem, as he'd been told, and he was praying in the temple, and he had a trance. And God spoke to him, telling him that he must leave immediately because his testimony would be rejected. And Paul is incredulous. He says to God, how can this be so? This can't be right. They know exactly who I am. They know what I've done. Surely they must take notice of just if nothing else who I am in my past. But God is adamant. He says, leave now, because I'm going to send you far away to the Gentiles. And at that point, the sermon stops because he's interrupted. At that point, everyone was listening intently. And those last words, it was like a bomb went off. The crowd went berserk, waving their clothes, throwing dust in the air. Their resentment blazed into fury. They screamed and they shouted with rage. They shouted, away with him. In other words, kill him. We were right all along. We should have killed him earlier when we had the chance. It is not fit that he should live. Now, it was not the word Gentile that Paul used. It wasn't some kind of trigger word. It was the claim by Paul that God had sent him as the apostle to the Gentiles, to be sent by God to preach to the Gentiles, and that enraged them. So, despite every attempt by Paul, despite his tact, care and charm, it was refused. But it was not Paul they were rejecting, it was the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, the tribune, who had hoped to something come out of this, was completely mystified because the entire speech was in Aramaic, which he understood scarcely a word of. So he decides that he'll go and find it out old school. So he brings Paul into the fortress to be flogged. Now, the instrument used, and it sounds pretty lame and pretty tame being flogged, but the instrument that they used was called the flagellum. And it was quite a fearful instrument of torture. It consisted of strips of leather weighted with rough pieces of metal or bone attached to a wooden handle. And if a man didn't die from it, he might be crippled for life. And as an aside, this was what the scourging that was done to our Lord Jesus Christ before his crucifixion. So just as they're tying up Paul, victims were usually tied to a post or a pillar to position them in the right place. He asks one question which brings everything to a standstill. Now, he seems to have judged the exact right moment to say this. It's almost quite amusing. They're tying him up to actually flog him, And all of a sudden he says to the centurion who's looking over the proceedings, by the way, is it legal to actually torture a Roman citizen before you've actually had him charged or had a trial? And the centurion knows very well that it is not legal, and so rushes up to find the tribune, who is incredibly worried. He is alarmed by the news, and quickly he comes straight down. And he's a bit suspicious because Paul looks a bit of a vagabond at this point, but he wants to find out. He said, "Is it true that you are a Roman citizen?" "I'm a Roman citizen. I paid a huge amount of money to become a Roman citizen." And he probably did, because in those days, the days of Claudius, it was effectively a bribe. And you could buy, for very large amounts of money, your Roman citizenship. But Paul's response was, "Bought? I was freeborn. I didn't have to buy anything. I was born a Roman citizen." And that changed everything. Paul is released from his chains. He's freed. He's kept in custody for his own safety. But now, from then on, you see a warming of the tribune to Paul, who must be shuddering at how close he had got to doing something very terrible. But unfortunately for him, he's still none the wiser what really was going on. So he goes to plan C. And this is, he'll call the chief priests and council, after all, they should be relatively civilized, and hold a meeting with them and have Paul there, and they can all discuss it out in a calm and collected way. And he will find out what has gone on, and he'll be able to write a report from it in case anyone asks. Now, so that's what he does. He arranges this, but that's for another day. Paul is not out of the woods yet. Things are going to get a lot worse for him. But what happens next, you'll have to wait for our next instalment of Acts in 23. Now, in conclusion, over our series, we've just discussed various purposes for which Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles. And one obvious one of this is this. Because it tells us not just what the apostles taught, but what they did. And this morning, we see this in action in the life of Paul. Now, sometimes we feel that because this book is a narrative, it doesn't really teach us anything. It's not like the epistles, for example. But what we hear here is what the teaching of the apostle was in the epistles in practice. If we read it carefully, we'll see that. We'll see that these are the teachings of Paul in his own life. How he lived out the gospel that he preached. There's a character in the Canterbury Tales. It's written in about the 14th century, and it's by a poet called Geoffrey Chaucer. And there aren't many positive depictions because it portrays various stories people would tell each other about characters on the way to Canterbury. But he mentions this one character who's quite outstanding. And it starts off a bit like this. "There was a poor parson in the town, but rich he was in word and work. He was a learned man and a clerk." And it carries on all about his good deeds and how he'd visit anyone, whatever the weather. But it ends like this. "Christ's gospel did he truly preach, but first he followed it himself." And this was Paul. Paul wasn't just a preacher, he was a doer. So the first point we have from Paul, just see how it worked out in his life. Now, I must admit, this band passed me by. And for some of you, you're probably too young. But it's not what you say, it's the way that you do it. And you perhaps tell me on a piece of paper who you think it was afterwards. But I mentioned earlier Mike's sermon of 2 weeks ago, where he raised the question, how far would you go to keep unity and peace? And just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, and Mike is there, and he will correct me if I've got this wrong, Mike was not saying that we should agree on everything and have no fixed principles, but quite the opposite. What Mike said was that unity does not require uniformity. Our diversity should not lead to disunity. The problem comes is when the things that divide us become more important than the things that the Saviour unites us with. And so we should bend over and backwards to accommodate others, even at the expense of our own personal freedoms. And Mike is nodding, so I've got that right. And as we see in this section, this is the way Paul behaved. But Paul is taking it one step further. His willingness to accommodate went through the whole of his life, with all he met. It wasn't just something he did in church, it was out of church as well. There was no separation in his life between his church life, his Christian life, and his private life. He always treated others with respect. And he was always courteous. He was tactful. He was winsome. Someone who practiced what he preached, whether Christian, Jew or Gentile. And I'll read his own words. Though I am free and belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under Christ's law. So as to win those not having the law, to the weak I became weak to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. So, to follow Mike's question, so the question is, what lengths will we go to treat people in a way even when we think we're being wronged? In church or out of church? I'll give an example, and it's not targeted at anyone in particular, because I notice that sometimes in our past we've noticed, and this is something my wife has taught me that I need to do, is be good to those who serve you. Whether you're in the shops, whether you're in restaurants or cafes, that these people are doing their best. How do I react to them? How do I react to other drivers when we feel that we've been cut up? Because just imagine following Sunday, we find that they're sitting in the row behind us. And I dare say it wouldn't matter what was said from the pulpit at that point, and you can just imagine how awkward it will be when you turn around to say hello to them. Following further from this, bold Christian witness is not being deliberately provocatively offensive or argumentative. We can upset others, non-Christians or Christians, by opinions and views which have nothing to do with the gospel. The problem is when we mix up our political views, our personal prejudices, our scruples, and we can potentially tarnish and smear the glorious gospel in the eyes of very people we would wish to win. The gospel is hard for people to hear. It can be offensive in its own right, but we don't need to make it harder. The final point is God's will is not always our will. If we suffer hardship and misfortune, if things don't turn out the way that we expect they should, sometimes we're tempted to wonder, well, what's gone wrong? Have I done something wrong, or am I in God's path? Is God not blessing me? But we've seen from the Apostle Paul that he's not like this at all. We saw over the last few weeks that Paul knew very well he's heading for trouble and didn't back away from it. And there were those at the time, and many since, who've claimed that Paul should not have gone to Jerusalem, that he was wrong in doing what he did there. But I think when we judge Paul like this, we're saying more about ourselves than we're saying about the will of God for Paul. The flip side of this is, if we are in the will of God, we are walking with God, and everything that happens to us, whatever the appearances are for our eternal good. No matter how dark, difficult, uncomfortable our circumstances, he will be there with us. And whilst he may not remove some of the problems from us, he will give us strength and comfort, not simply just to get by, but to triumph. And the life of Paul is proof of this. I think if you ask Paul a few years later, when things have gotten even worse, he was now on death row perhaps, Paul, do you have any regrets? And he'd say, regrets? Never. And how do I know this? Because Paul wrote, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served the advance of the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to anyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. the former out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that he could add trouble to me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice.